It's quite an exciting stage as we go into the very last bit of data collection. As Nicola said, I'm in the third year of this project. It's a project, the topic normally falls within the physical sciences, impact of trees on hydrology, but we are specifically looking at it within its real world landscape with culture, heritage, situated expertise and lived experience. We found we're not dealing with two separate disciplines, but drawing on methodologies of those disciplines and some interdisciplinary approaches in order to work in this sort of very entangled landscape of land use change, focusing the challenges of tree planting for nature-based solutions on natural flood management. So it's a big project to introduce in 10 minutes. I'm going to do my best. Can I just check that you are currently seeing Forest Floods and Farmers being on your screens?
Yes, we are.
Excellent.
All good.
So if I scroll down on this, so the project took 3 stages, and we started with the well evidenced possibility that the most relevant expertise and knowledge would be held by those who are in the landscape. So stage 1 of this project looked at very social methodologies and some of the preliminary physical catchment methodologies. And we were really, the key ones of those were looking at semi-structured interviews and in-placed on-site participant mapping. And this gave us a real wealth of qualitative and quantitative data and some provisional findings out of this. Key ideas that land managers and farmers in particular have multiple drivers for decision making. One of the things that I found was that despite sort of 80% of participants starting a conversation with, we don't need any more trees, we're a very tree landscape, by the end of the conversation, the majority of participants in areas we're looking for were either able to identify areas or schemes where tree planting would be suitable within their landscape, or in many cases were actively already planting for a variety of reasons. And there are a range of other knowledges and information that came out of my work within the catchment, but a few of them were very interesting because they had a direct impact on my next stage of methodology. And that because I was looking at flood management, I was looking at the potential of modelling catchment behaviour, and actually these interviews with in-placement had a direct impact on the model choice that I made and also the types of data collection that I was doing. Anyone who has worked within any form of farmed catchment will understand of the complexity of drainage and how drains across the years have made a royal mess of our landscape. But it meant that within my catchment, for example, there was a level of accuracy which would be irrelevant because of the inherent uncertainties of what went on at a field scale, which made the way in which we looked at data very interesting within the catchment. There were also a wide range of impacts on things like where the flooding was important and where it wasn't. One of the interesting things about this catchment is that it is considered formally as a low risk catchment, even though the picture you can see in front of you, this is a river that is normally about 1 metre across and 30 centimetres high, and it gets to this stage in under 12 hours. So it is not a not dangerous catchment, but it does fall into the economic standard of low risk as far as flood risk work is done. So our next stage was the hydrological model. Building a baseline model, we used a lot of remote sense data that was ground truthed, and we went through this process of developing this baseline model. We used Sheetran. As I said, that was chosen based on work from with the participants because it covered sheet flow and it enabled us to look at land use within the catchment quite specifically. A good way of imagining it is it's a 200 by 200 square grid, and then there are layers of information, but you are also, it is a spatially distributed grid. So each square has a 3D relevant information to the land use, the soil types, the vegetation, and your computer works out what happens when you put water into that one, and then works out what happens to the next one, and so on and so forth. So we built this model, and that gives us a lovely hydrograph, and which we can start to put through our calibration validation series. And I would point out, I'm not trying in any way to work at proving this model. This is something that has already been used in a number of catchments. There's some things it can tell us, some things it can't, but it enabled us to look at things like synchronicity and phreatic surface levels, so the water table, and check that against information that we knew. And then this is what I have found so far, one of the really exciting parts, is to then develop our alternative land use scenarios. So we have our land cover grid, and I've included it on the right with the land photograph to show how complex it is. We're having to reduce it to this quite simplistic 200 by 200 grid. The mask I've put on top so that you can see the shape of the catchment more clearly. And then what I did was I used those interviews and participant maps and information from wider research and policy to develop alternative land use scenarios. And it meant that I could do things like take qualitative data to identify a particular feature, digitize participant maps to put those features onto the landscape, and then using those digitized maps, get the geographic and spatial characteristics of that feature. So for example, when people talked about steepness of slopes, they've drawn on the maps, I can identify the slope they're talking about, and I can actually get a value for the steepness of that slope. So when they say we will plant above a certain steepness, I then have a quantitative value I can use for that. And I can go, okay, what happens if I identify all these areas above that steepness that was identified through these participant maps? And then you put it back through your modeling process, and we had 16 different alternative scenarios. You will be very annoyed to see that I have cut all the names off the maps, because I would say at this stage, this is very, very provisional data. You can see quite clearly that there is a difference in these hydrograph flood peaks, and it is a significant difference. We do have on here 3 loss models. So there were some key things that came up through the catchment. The loss of ash trees is a big concern, and I've modelled that by removing broadleaf areas, because that was it is predominantly ash woodland in there. And then things like there's a big movement towards growing maize within the catchment, which meant that there's no overwinter crop. So we looked at what would happen if more of those arable fields were cropless. But the rest of the scenarios focus on a wide range of different treescape interventions that were suitable within the farmed, suitable or not. Some of them, I have done some bigger ones for comparison within the farm landscape, and we got some really interesting results out of that. One of the primary ones being, obviously there is a relation between the more you plant, and again ignoring those loss models, because this is change in a change in scenario rather than actual number of trees. There is a relationship between the amount of planting you do, according to this model, and the impact on your hydrographs, but it's not consistent. It's not a straight line. These aren't similarly based points. They are very discrete alternative scenarios. So there are different reasons why each of these points sits on this graph. These two are of particular interest. This one is a model that was to identify an arable crop, if you like, of say willows, and this one was a very, very big riparian woodland, and they sit well outside of our straight line, and there's some very interesting implications there. So we've got these provisional indications, some of them being that these suitable woodland features actually work for the impacts on flood peaks. We've got that increase in planting isn't necessarily a decrease in flooding, although there is a relation there. Unpredictable riparian hydrographs, planting at diverse locations can be interesting, but we have to take this all to our next key stage, which obviously we've had big delays and a move online with the COVID scenario. But I am looking at running prior to around the end of April, focus groups to take this information back to land managers and landowners in the catchment, to talk to the catchment community. I would also like to talk to policy makers and practitioners and wider UK stakeholders who might be involved in this, to look at, does this information from the model, the bits that we can take out of it, does it impact on decision making? And how does it fit in with other knowledges within the catchment? So, because our process of decision making, when you actually get onto the ground, becomes very complex and very interesting, and that will be the final stage of the project. So if there's any questions, please ask, but otherwise my contact details are on the screen, and please do feel free to get in touch. I'll put my contact details in. I'll assume that people can get hold of me so that I can stop sharing.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Really fascinating and very relevant to sort of